Welcome to OUTcast, the podcast where we hear coming out stories from famous faces and brilliant LGBTQ+ people working hard behind the scenes, from all backgrounds and from all corners of the globe. On this podcast, we discover life stories, and in doing so, we dissect some of the most pressing issues faced by the LGBTQ+ community today. We hope we can support and inspire you, our listeners, whether you're part of the LGBTQ+ community, out or not, or an ally listening to learn more. I'm Rosie Pentreath, your host, and I've shared my coming out story in writing and on various panels, and I know firsthand the value of talking through my experiences. Now I'm giving people from all corners of life and from all backgrounds the same opportunity. You may have listened to other episodes before, and if you have, thank you for coming back. Or you may be here for the first time because of our guest. Welcome. You can follow us on social media at OUTcast LGBT, and you can find us online at outcastpod.com. Thank you for listening. Hello, welcome to the third season of OUTcast Podcast. For our first episode, we're joined by Luke Rutledge, who's an Australian author. His debut novel, A Man and His Pride, is set at the time Australia was grappling with the debate around marriage equality in 2017. Luke writes evocatively about the gay experience in the city of Brisbane at the time. It's a gorgeous book. It flows and it's light and it's fun, but it also speaks deeply to shame and to the complexities of being an out gay person and the complexities of the plebiscite. In this chat, me and Luke talk about the plebiscite. We talk about his book and the issues in it. We talk about World Pride, which is coming up in Australia this year. And we cover issues that most LGBTQ people will have felt. Luke, welcome to OUTcast. Thanks so much for joining us. It's great to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me, Rosie. It's really good to be here.
We're speaking just as your debut novel, A Man and His Pride, is released in Australia. You dedicate the book to those who are yet to find their pride. So let's dive straight into that to begin with, who these people who are yet to find their pride are, and what it's like not to find your pride yet.
So A Man and His Pride is about Sean Preston, who is a 23-year-old gay man living in Brisbane during the 2017 marriage equality plebiscite here in Australia. When we first meet Sean, he's just been dumped by his first ever boyfriend of 3 months in a very brutal way. And so he sort of vows to never become emotionally attached to another guy ever again. So, we sort of start to see him slip into some of his old habits, I guess, of, drinking a lot, seeking out a lot of sort of casual sex that leaves him feeling quite empty. And he spends way too much time at the gym working on that all-important body. So he's kind of a bit adrift in the world, I suppose. He's sort of living without purpose. Then he meets a guy called William, who is also a gay man, but kind of the exact opposite of Sean. William is unapologetically gay. He is very loud and proud about who he is. And he has a long history of long-term relationships, which is very different from Sean. But he's also very naive about the gay dating scene. And so Sean agrees to help him navigate the dating scene a little bit. And so we start to see this friendship sort of start to blossom between the two. And in doing so, Sean starts to have his own eyes a bit, opened a little bit more, and he starts to change the way that he thinks about being gay and start to confront some of that internalized shame that he's been living with for a long time. So it's a novel about finding your pride. It's about learning to love and accept yourself for who you are. It's a story mostly about this friendship between these two gay men.
It comes across in the writing, Sean is so judgmental and he's carrying all the shame. But like you say, when you kind of get to the end of the book, there's this more sort of rounded, like mature approach to friendship and to relationships that he has, and William is obviously such a big part of that. Going back to that idea of like people who haven't found their pride, in the book, Sean is out, but he's not necessarily sort of loud and proud, and there's a lot of internalized shame. Why do feelings like that sort of linger in the LGBTQ plus community?
Yeah, look, I think when I set out to write the novel, I knew that I wanted to write a story about a man who was gay and for it to revolve around his sexuality in some way, just because that's, a topic that interests me, I suppose. But I didn't want to write just another sort of coming out story. I feel like there are a lot of those out there now, which is wonderful. But there's less out there that sort of deal with the part that comes next, I suppose, the what happens after the coming out. So that was kind of like the idea that I had in my head for what I wanted to get across when I thought about starting this book. Because, of course, coming out isn't just a one-off event. Like, it's not just one moment in time. It's a whole journey that gay people go on. And this idea of, I guess, like, what happens next after the coming out was something that kind of intrigued me, because I think that it's something that we all really go through, really. So, I wanted to explore that grey area between being in the closet and being out and proud, which I think is probably a more common place for queer people to find themselves, in that sort of messy middle. And, people have asked me, like, are you Sean? Is this your story? Well, I should say up front, no, it's not. It's not my story personally, but I have met men like Sean, men who I suppose struck me as like they were out and open about being gay, but they hadn't sort of learned to take that next step of learning to accept themselves. And so it just sort of struck me that there was a lot of baggage there and a lot of internalized shame that they hadn't sort of worked through. So that kind of had always stuck with me, I suppose. And then when I sat down to write the book and think about what I wanted to write about, those people sort of started to come to the fore a little bit more. So, yeah.
Like you say, it's not just a one fix. You don't come out and then you're done. This sort of lying in that next stage of full acceptance is a big deal. Even on a low day, or the wrong comment from someone in the wrong moment when we're run down, can bring shame hurtling back at us unexpectedly and things. What would you say to someone who asked, it's 2023, why would people share coming out stories now?
Well, I think it's just as important as it's ever been, really, sharing those stories, because it's so important to see yourself reflected in the stories that you read and the movies that you watch. And we now live in an era where we've got shows like Heartstopper on Netflix, or Love, Simon, that are telling those really positive, like those coming out stories in a very positive way. And I wish that those stories had been around when I was younger, because I think it would have made a real difference, really. So I don't think that the need to tell those stories will ever go away, really. Like, it needs to be normalized for you to start to be able to accept it for yourself. And I think finding your pride is essentially also reaching a point where it's just kind of normalized. So when you do get those comments, as you say, someone might make a comment that brings up a lot of that shame again, you can sort of move past it and you've worked through those issues, I suppose. So yeah, I think that the need to tell those stories will always be there. And what an exciting time that we live in now, where gay stories do seem to be everywhere.
This is also a great segue into your coming out story.
My coming out experience was actually a very positive one, really. As I said, Sean's story is not my story. I received nothing but love and support from my family and friends when I came out. And I remember, there was a lot of crying at the time. It was a big moment. But I do remember this overwhelming sense of embarrassment and shame, actually, when I did finally come out. And I should sort of backtrack. That experience followed a very long period in my life where I struggled a lot with my sexuality. So I didn't come out till I was about 23. And when I say come out, I mean that was how old I was when I first admitted to myself that I was gay, let alone, everybody else. So I spent all of my teens and much of my early 20s burying myself in this deep denial. And the weirdest thing that I've often reflected on is that I never really had a reason to stay in the closet. Like, I knew that my friends would all be accepting of it. I knew that my parents would love me no matter what. There was never any real external fear factor that, you could pinpoint to say, oh, that's why he took so long to come out. It sort of all come from within. And so I've often wondered what it was that was holding me back. And, honestly, I can't really pinpoint one thing, because it's never just one thing. I think it's always a combination. And for me, I think it was not having any gay role models when I was a kid. So as I said before, I wasn't watching movies or TV shows that had gay characters or storylines. I wasn't reading books. I was too scared. And then the other thing, I think at some point I must have received the message that being gay was unacceptable, because as a teenager, I was quite homophobic myself. And I don't mean I was a bully or anything, but yeah, if I saw two men kissing, which, was extremely rare, I'd feel deeply uncomfortable about it and try not to think about it. So I had a lot of internalized shame myself, and that shame just sort of grew and grew as I got older. And the lie that I told myself just got more and more convincing in my head. So yeah, I think denial is a weird thing. It's something that I think about a lot, and it's impossible to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it, because even though on some level you know the truth, you know who you really are, but you believe the lie anyway. So you spend so many years lying to yourself that it just becomes your reality. My denial was so deep that I managed to get through an entire music degree at university and still not face it. So I was immersed in the arts, essentially, where there's lots of gay people around. But somehow I went through that entire period of my life and I still believe that I was straight. So I entered my 20s and I changed career direction. And it was during that time that I dated a girl for 2 years. And, it was that relationship that ultimately pushed me to finally face it, because I could just see myself as one of these men who, was closeted in their 40s and married, and that thought just kind of terrified me above anything else. So that's when I finally came out. And so then, for someone who'd spent, all of their life trying to deny it, once I did finally come out, I think I moved quite quickly, really, in telling people that I was gay. Like, I felt this need to just tell everybody, basically. Like, I had this news to tell, And, at first I got no joy out of it. Telling my parents was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. Telling my housemates who I'd lived with for a few years, that was really hard, because essentially I was admitting that I'd been lying to them all this time. And, looking back, it seems ridiculous, completely blown out of proportion, but that was just kind of the state of mind that I was in at the time. And then I made a list of everyone who I had to tell, a list of friends. And so each person that I spoke to, it got a bit easier, as I sort of had that same conversation over and over again. And it was like I was finally finding the words to describe it all. But like I said at the beginning, from that point on, it was a very positive experience, really.
Gosh, it's really interesting what you say. There's a lot of parallels from my memories of coming out and kind of, being very young and realizing I felt differently towards women than towards men. Yeah, when I was at university, I'd sort of say to people, I've got this big secret, this terrible secret, I just can't tell you. And eventually at the end of university, I came out to my parents, and that's when I also had the conversation with a few of those people, and everyone was so kind. But the word lie that you said, that you felt like you'd been lying to your flatmates or lying to your family perhaps, I felt similar, like this weird sort of guilt around telling a lie, but it was about me. It was about you. So why would it be a lie? Like, it's so interesting. And I hope a few people listening to this are allies and perhaps haven't held that kind of shame and secret before, because I think what we're teasing out is that it can be really insidious. It's not this kind of big, obvious thing. You kind of have to work through really complicated denial, like you say, shame, and these kind of internalized kind of mini shames. So perhaps someone in the playground went, "Oh God, you're gay," or, "I don't want to be a dyke like so and so."
Yeah.
Those things really have such an impact, and like they can change the entire course of your kind of young adult life or beyond. Coming out stories from inspiring LGBTQ+ people today.
Coming out is something that it's like a physical act. Like people can see what you're doing because you're admitting it to someone, you're having a conversation with them, you're coming out to them. Whereas that taking that next step of finding your pride is something I think that happens very much internally. It's almost like it's a shift in your mindset, I suppose. And as you say, it's working back through and untangling all of the lies that you've been telling yourself for so many years, that internalized shame that you've held onto for so long. So it's a process, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and finding your pride even is a process, because I like to think that I'm fully proud, if that's a thing, 100% proud, no room for not proud. But even the other day, I just sort of mumbled them when I was talking about my other half, whereas in another mood or another place, I might have just said my wife. It takes years and years and years, and it's really fascinating to kind of think why that is.
Yeah.
Are there any kind of big times that you can remember after you'd come out, even a few years after, where you weren't out, where you didn't want to say it?
Honestly, actually, no, because my experience after coming out was so positive. So it happened to coincide with I just finished university and started a new job, and it was a job in the union movement, at a union that was predominantly like women working there. And so it was an incredibly safe space. Like, I felt very safe to finally start to figure out who I was. And I'm not saying it was all smooth sailing. Like, I did enter a bit of a roller coaster period in my life after that. I was incredibly naive about a lot of things, but mostly about the gay community itself and the gay dating scene, because I had essentially not allowed myself to even think about being gay for all my life. And so I had no idea what to expect, let alone what I wanted or what I liked. This idea of gay culture or pride was just kind of a foreign concept to me, and I'd never really thought about it before. Interestingly, though, what I did know was that I wanted a boyfriend straight away. So right from the beginning, I wanted a meaningful relationship and I wanted companionship, which kind of, I suppose, speaks to how I was raised as well, and the support that I got right from the outset, I suppose. But given how much internalized shame I had been carrying around for so long, looking back, I think that's actually probably quite strange, really, that I wanted to jump straight into a relationship. So one of the first things I did was I got online and created a profile and started chatting to men. And suffice to say, I just wasn't ready for that experience, because I was a 23-year-old who'd never been with a man before, and I was looking for a relationship on Grindr. Essentially, I'd skipped those all important formative years where you're meant to explore all that stuff and find out what you like and what you don't like and what you want. And here I was trying to jump straight into a relationship. So there were some issues there and a lot of things to work through during that period, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, like a steep learning curve.
Yes.
That's something the book does so well, is really paint the laws and the experiences of the gay dating scene, perhaps I'll say the gay male dating scene.
One thing that I did want to do with the book was to depict the gay dating scene in maybe a more maybe realistic, less sanitized way than what we're perhaps used to seeing in the mainstream anyway. It's not all parties and dancing and singing and glitter and rainbows and the rest of it. I mean, it can be those things, and it often is, but there is another side to it as well. And when you're talking about a marginalized community that is made up of individuals, many of whom have had their own traumas and often rejections, that kind of thing, I think that those experiences find their way into the culture of a community. So, for example, I think that there is a lot of body image issues particularly in the gay. I'm talking specifically about the gay dating scene here. There's this obsession with what you look like and having that all important body. I think there's issues with toxic masculinity in the gay dating scene as well. I've met men who, they don't want to have anything to do with you if you sound feminine or, flamboyant or whatever. That's their own internalized shame there reflected out, And then, of course, there's the more promiscuous nature of particularly the Grindr dating scene. I'm not here to judge Grindr, say if it's a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's both, actually. I think it's definitely has a role to play with allowing gay men to explore themselves and make those connections if that's what they want, you want to do. But at the same time, it's like any tool that can be abused. And I think that if Grindr is the only way that you're making those connections with people through, casual sex or whatever, then it's probably not the healthiest thing. So I wanted to explore all of that stuff in the book. But at the same time, I wanted to do it in a way that was still, I wouldn't say light, but it's just enjoyable. Like, it's not a heavy read, And I wanted it to ultimately be uplifting and to be hopeful. I didn't want to just cast this shadow across the gay dating scene. It's not all like that, and it doesn't have to be like that if you don't want it to be.
Yeah, and it is. It's a really kind of light, fast, just lovely read that does come across. Picking up what you said there, just briefly, it's so true. There are issues of being LGBTQ plus specifically, but then within the community, issues of patriarchy, toxic masculinity, sexism, racism still exist, and that is always what comes through on these chats.
I think it's also easy to forget that we do tend to live in our bubbles, I think. And I recognize that I live in a very privileged position. Like, I hold a very privileged position, with supportive family, friends. I have a fiance. We can walk down the street, hold hands, no one bats an eyelid. It's a very fortunate position to be in. So but I don't know if that's the case for, people who live maybe not in the cities. Like, we know that young LGBT people are still overrepresented in mental health statistics and suicide rates and all that sort of stuff. So I think so long as that is still happening out in the world, I think, as I said a little while ago, like, we're always going to need to keep telling these stories and just keep pushing past those prejudices, because I think there are still pockets of society where certain beliefs are still entrenched. And, the marriage equality campaign, I think, brought all of that to the boil and gave those people who essentially had bigoted views a platform to broadcast those views.
Yeah, definitely. And Australia's marriage equality plebiscite of 2017 is a kind of backdrop to your book. For context, for listeners outside Australia, marriage was only legal between a man and a woman couple, essentially. That was marriage law in Australia. The government put the question out to the public, should the law be changed to allow same-sex couples to marry?
Yeah.
And like you say, it kind of allowed voices to come out of the woodwork, perhaps not come out of the woodwork, be amplified, I would say, really homophobic and really intolerant voices
Yeah.
to be amplified against the LGBTQ plus community and other marginalised people. Yeah, how would you describe what it was like being a queer person in Australia during the plebiscite?
I think it was a very tense time, overwhelmingly tense. And I think it was never a campaign about convincing people to vote yes, because I think that debate had been going on for years and years already, and in a sense, I think had already been won. Like all the opinion polls pointed to majority of people supporting same-sex marriage in Australia. The danger was always not enough people turning out to vote.
Mhm.
And I think the no campaign were really that was our whole strategy essentially, was to either confuse enough people or just hope that enough people would just be apathetic about the campaign, not care enough about it and not turn out to vote. Because obviously it's easy to mobilize the no, those who are staunchly on the no side and those who are adamant on voting yes. Like you're always going to get those people to vote,
Mhm.
but it's everyone in the middle who are just, they have to go about their lives. They don't want to think about this sort of stuff. And yeah, so that was always the danger, that it just wouldn't get up because not enough people voted. And it was essentially a political strategy from the government of the day to sort of kick the can down the road. But for me personally, I mean, by 2017, I had been out for a number of years, and so I had reached a point where I was, quite comfortable being gay. I was quite proud of it. So I heard all of that sort of negative, rhetoric in the media from the No campaign, and I could sort of just brush it off and not really care too much about it. Didn't think too much. But of course, a lot of other people weren't perhaps so fortunate. Young people who may have been questioning their sexuality or
Mhm.
living in a household where it was acceptable to talk about that sort of thing. So yeah, it was an interesting period. One thing that really stood out to me was on a union building that we have in South Brisbane. So like in the heart of the city, they had this big sign on the side of the building that was like 20 meters long, like this big sort of canvas thing. And it said equality is union business. So it was, nice supportive sign. Anyway, during the campaign, someone stole that sign, like in the middle of the night. To steal a sign that big, you'd have to come along with a ute or something and truck it away or whatever. It just made me think, like at the time I laughed about it because it just seemed so ridiculous, but it sort of made me think later, wow, so there are actually people out there here in Brisbane who care enough about making sure this doesn't get up, that they be bothered to actually turn out in the middle of the night and steal this sign. So just, I don't know, things like that.
That's what really affected me, was those efforts, like the skywriting. Someone's gone to great expense to write one word, and I know it's just a simple word,
Mm,
2 letters, NO. But the fact that someone has, booked the plane, made sure they could send this message, it's just, and it's cowardly because they weren't the face of it either. They just sent this, like, cowardly message into the sky and made so much effort to be against something that probably, although maybe it does have something to do with them, but probably doesn't have anything to do with them.
the main point is it didn't have to happen. Like we didn't have to have that campaign. It was just a simple matter of changing a piece of legislation and passing it. It's not like we were having a referendum. It was essentially just a really expensive opinion poll. And I do remember speaking to a friend of a friend at the time who worked at Lifeline, and she did say to me that they had noticed a definite sort of spike in the number of particularly young people who were calling distressed about the things that they were seeing on the television and hearing on the radio or whatever. So it definitely had a negative impact. I mean, obviously the outcome was good. It was a unifying moment, but all of that other stuff just could have been easily avoided. Yeah.
And the outcome, for listeners who might not know, was, yes. We did achieve yes, and we did
Yeah.
achieve marriage equality. But like you say, Luke, like you said earlier, is the marginalised and the less supported people as well that are affected by things like this, by government policy that encourages, hate speech effectively to come out of the woodwork or to be amplified, as I said earlier. How do you think having marriage equality has sort of changed Australia?
I think it's just made Australia a better place, like a more equal place, because in the eyes of the law, that was one major thing that, queer people were being discriminated against quite clearly in the eyes of the law. So I do remember, and this is in the book actually, a piece of research that came out about marriage equality in America, and the states that had introduced same-sex marriage at that time. This was before the whole country had it. They had noticed a decrease in suicide rates in LGBT people. So I think that just shows you what effect it has in the shift in people's perceptions. Because I think if the law discriminates against a minority group, then that almost gives people permission to discriminate as well. So it does change people's perceptions, or at least it's the first kind of logical step to changing people's perceptions, I think.
It's kind of a really positive, perhaps subtle butterfly effect of this, acceptance and equality, literally having the same access to this part of the law to marriage makes this wonderful butterfly effect of hopefully more and more acceptance and love. OUTcast, coming out stories from inspiring LGBTQ plus people today.
The main difference is choice, right? Like we now have that choice
Yeah.
with how we want to live our lives, and marriage will not be for everybody, but at least we've got that choice open to us. We can choose to get married and have children and have that sort of traditional family unit, or you can reject the more conventional way of living and go another way. But the point is that we have that choice.
Yeah, exactly. Just being treated the same as if you're not LGBTQ plus. So from that sort of slightly tarnished year, 2017, it's 2023, and this year World Pride comes to Australia, to Sydney. Really excited. And I know the release of your book sort of coincides with World Pride Month really hotting up. What do you think it means for the country to kind of have the honour of hosting this event?
World Pride is the ultimate visibility, isn't it? It's the ultimate way of celebrating your pride and countering the opposite of pride, which is shame. The ABC, I believe, is broadcasting a lot of it, which I think is a really good thing, because I think it's often those people who are not living in Sydney, which can be a bit of a bubble. I think it's
Yeah.
such a huge gay population down there. The idea of other people around the country getting to witness some, of the events that are taking place, I think is probably really the main point of World Pride, really. I mean, yes, there's the partying and the festivals happening, and there's over 200 events, I think. But I just hope that people outside of Sydney get to experience it as well.
What I'm hoping, and I hope this happens, it might be an assumption, but what I'm hoping is World Pride as a concept just echoes across the whole country, and all different, venues and communities and groups in all the states and all the territories in regional and town and city areas kind of end up doing their own nod to Pride, and it helps kind of spread the love and awareness.
Yeah, oh, that'd be amazing. These events are very important because it's all about visibility at the end of the day, and just normalizing the idea of being gay today, I guess. Yeah.
Pride is about the whole spectrum found in the LGBTQIA plus community. How can we all be better allies to the diversity of people within that community?
I think listening would have to be the main thing, because often I hear terms and different things that I've never heard before myself as a gay man. And just because you're gay doesn't mean you're across everything, you know, all these changes that go on in our community that a lot of people do struggle to keep up with, I think. So honestly, I would just say, like, the main thing to do is to keep listening and to just keep an open mind about changing the way that you think, and just questioning maybe some of your inner biases as well. And just providing that space for people who come from different backgrounds to you, whether it's gender or sexuality or whatever, just giving them that opportunity to have their voice and to speak for themselves, and just listen to what they have to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And what gives you hope today and for the future?
The main thing is visibility, and how normalized being gay and being in a gay relationship is today. I don't think it's a stretch to say that the majority of Australians either support queer relationships, or they're just sort of indifferent to it, and don't particularly care one way or the other. I think we're sort of living with the best of two worlds, really, because we're living in a society where the majority of people do support you. Like, you can walk around knowing that you are supported by those around you. And also, we're living in a time where you do have that visibility in the media, particularly the mainstream media. So I'm talking specifically about movies, TV shows, and books. It's not that unusual. In fact, it's pretty difficult to find a show these days that doesn't have some sort of queer character in it. But more than that, there's more and more shows coming out, or books, where, you know, that is actually at the center of the story. And making their way into the mainstream, into the mainstream culture. So I think that that's actually really, really exciting. And, you know, going back to what I was saying before, like, I wish that I'd lived at a time where that was the case, because I think seeing yourself represented, your own stories represented in the stories that you consume, is just so important, because it just normalizes it, and it makes you realize that you're not alone in the experiences that you might be going through. What I set out to do more than anything else with writing this book was, I just wanted to write something that I personally would want to read, and I like to read page turners and books that make me feel good, and queer stories. And so I just wanted to write something that would be, more than anything else, just entertaining and leave people feeling hopeful. That's something else that gives me hope, I suppose, is the fact that I was able to write a book that is distinctly Australian and queer, and deals with, you know, some of those more serious issues, and for it to actually get picked up by a major publisher. Like, I don't think that maybe if I'd written it 10 years ago, maybe even less, like, I don't know if that would have been the case. But the fact that a publisher thinks that sort of story is viable enough, like, to reach a broad enough audience in Australia today, I think is quite telling.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. And when you think about the journey that you've been through, so not, you know, coming out to yourself until you were 23, and then working through that, and now you've written this incredible book, which is a page turner, by the way, and everyone should go out and buy it. A Man and His Pride is out now once this episode is published, and yeah, it really is a wonderful read.
Thank you so much. That's lovely to hear.
Thanks so much for coming on to OUTcast. It's been amazing to speak with you, and hear your thoughts on coming out, on World Pride, and on that plebiscite that we now want to forget. Thanks so much, Luke.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to OUTcast, a podcast with interviews and coming out stories from inspiring LGBTQ+ people. Don't forget to go back and listen to other episodes if you're new to the show. We have a fascinating interview with Tilly Lawless, the Sydney-based queer sex worker and novelist, as well as the British transgender priest Sarah Jones, and Gogglebox Australia's Tim Lay of Tim and Leanne fame. I'm your host, Rosie Pentreath. I hope you can join us again next week.